Hello, Phil here from Wings of Pegasus and welcome to another analysis video. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. On the agenda tonight, we're going back to 1958. We're going to be taking a look at the Kingston Trio and they're going to be performing Tom Dooley. So let's get the guys up on screen and see how they get on.
Throughout history, there have been many songs written about the eternal triangle. This next one tells the true story of a Mr. Grayson, a beautiful woman, and a condemned man named Tom Dooley. When the sun rises tomorrow, Tom Dooley must hang. Hang down your head, Tom Dooley, hang down your head and cry. Hang down your head, Tom Dooley, oh boy, you're bound to die. I met her on the mountain, there I took her life. Met her on the mountain, stabbed her with my knife. Hang down your head, Tom Dooley, hang down your head and cry. Oh boy, oh boy. Hang down your head, Tom Dooley, poor boy, you're bound to die. This time tomorrow, reckon where I'll be. Hadn't have been for Grayson, I'd have been in Tennessee. Oh well, now go hang down your head and cry. Hang down your head and cry. Hang down your head and cry. Oh boy, you're bound to die. Oh well, now go hang down your head and cry. Hang down your head and cry. Oh boy, you're bound to die.
I'm just going to jump in here because this is one of those compositions that is based over this chord progression that's just two chords, and if you're wondering what those are, we've got a B7th and an E chord, so you'll be having your capo or capo depending on where you're from on the 7th fret of your guitar in standard tuning. It's got such a morbid feel to it because of the lyrical content, but it's such a contrast being over those major chords. And there isn't any minor chords in this whole progression because it's just two chords the whole way through. And this is something that you hear songs being referred to as a three-chord wonder. And you've only got two here, so throughout the whole composition, very little variation, which shows you the importance of the lyrical content. And by the way, this wasn't a Kingston Trio song. They didn't write it themselves. It had been around since the 1800s because, as you heard at the beginning, it is a true story, and that's exactly when the song came into being because of the situation at that time. This song really goes against the grain with everything that people are expecting to hear, because I think people want to hear a happy ending, and especially when you're writing a song that isn't based on real life events, you can put that in there. But here, it's just straight down the line, telling you the story as it was. And this song was huge. It did get a lot of radio airplay from their debut album, and it wasn't released initially as a single, so people were buying the album to hear this song. And when they did release this song as a standalone single, it sold over 3 million copies, which is just crazy numbers because we're talking about the days before the internet, of course. 1958. They also won a Grammy in 1959, and this kind of music at the time with the Grammys, they classed it as country and western, and then the next year, partly due to the fact that the Kingston Trio won the previous year, they then had a category for folk music. And talking about these guys and folk music, they didn't see themselves as folk artists, but very much got put in that genre, and is something that did inspire a lot of future generations watching the Kingston Trio, but also addressing these kind of topics, or having a song that is so different like this with the lyrical content, really did open the floodgates for artists to write about whatever they wanted to. And especially later on in the 60s, mid-60s, late 60s, it took a political turn where there would be a lot of folk artists who would write about their own points of view about politics at that time, and the whole protest movement, and people that really got behind music that was stating their point of view and giving them a voice. So it really did become something that was mainstream and accessible to everyone, especially considering those numbers that I mentioned earlier with this song in particular and how well it sold. And then the band as a whole, with all of their albums, the next 4 or 5 albums did really well as well, to the point where they would have 4 albums in the top 10 of the album charts all at one time. And that was the first and only time since that's ever happened. Putting the focus on this performance, we've got those 2 guitars and banjo, and because there are only 2 chords throughout the whole composition, it means that the vocals have got to be spot on, especially considering that they're singing in harmony as well. Also, the dynamics with their playing is so low in order to allow the voices to be heard nice and clearly, because we're not having belting chest voice vocals here. It's very softly delivered. It really does help to maximize that connection with the audience, but also to allow the words to be understood really clearly because of the nature of that delivery. The other thing to mention is that these guys worked really hard at it in order to perfect their vocals and their harmony lines and the dynamics of their playing for live performance. Frank Verber, when he signed these guys as a manager, he got them together and made sure that they practiced and practiced and practiced for 6 to 8 hours a day for months in order to perfect their live show. And this is what it was all about in the late 50s, early 60s, was playing live and just recording things in one take. And then that performance was put on a record. Just quickly to mention how the Kingston Trio came into contact with this song, because Frank Warner was singing it and Nick Reynolds from the Kingston Trio heard it, and they decided to do this song. And Frank Prophet had taught Frank Warner this song because Frank's family knew the guy being hung in the first place, which is Tom Dooley, all the way back in the 1800s. So Frank Prophet had learnt this song from his father and his grandmother, so they were directly connected to the original story. In fact, this version of the song by the Kingston Trio was seen as being so similar to that of Frank Prophet's that they had to pay Frank royalties for this song, because the Kingston Trio didn't initially state that it was based on Frank's version. And like I said, none of them wrote this song. It was just one of those songs that was in the public domain, which just tended to be the case with really old songs, compositions, and folk songs as well. Just they were sung and nobody knew who wrote them in the first place. But then with copyright, and as money started to get involved with record labels, bands would try to copyright songs that were originally in the public domain. But we will get into a little bit more of the history of the Kingston Trio at the end of this video. Let's get back into this performance and we'll watch it to the end.
This time tomorrow, reckon where I'll be, down in some lonesome valley, hanging from a white oak tree. Hang down your head, Tom Dooley, hang down your head and cry. Oh boy, oh well. Hang down your head, Tom Dooley, oh boy, you're bound to die. Oh well, now go. Hang down your head, Tom Dooley, hang down your head and cry. Oh boy, oh well. Now hang down your head, Tom Dooley, oh boy, you're bound to die. Oh boy, you're bound to die. Oh boy, you're bound to die.
And there we have it. So looking at those performance elements again, you can hear how they do lean into the vocal in certain sections to be a little bit more dramatic with that delivery, and the harmonies, like I said, spot on the whole way through. Just to mention, we've got Nick on the right hand side, Nick Reynolds, who I mentioned earlier, and then we've got Bob Shane in the middle with his easy vocal delivery that is so easy to listen to. And we've also got Dave Guard on the left hand side. But when you're in a trio, especially vocally, every voice is just as important as the last. So these guys are really relying on each other to nail the harmony lines, to be in key, but also to match each other dynamically. Just to quickly cover a bit of the history, because Dave and Bob knew each other. They were school friends at junior high, and they're both into music, and they both learned how to play the ukulele at school. And in 1952 is when they bumped into Nick, and they got together as a trio because Nick knew some folk songs and calypso songs as well, and could play and sing. So they had this trio and they performed for friends, and it wasn't really something that they were looking at doing professionally. They were just having fun doing it. So that's just how it started. So as there were no professional aspirations, Bob went away and got a job, did the normal life thing. Dave and Nick continued to sing with two other singers, and they were performing as that quartet when Frank Verber got involved. And Frank saw them and thought that one of the members didn't have what was required to get to the next level, so he suggested that they should streamline and get rid of that member. But then the other member left, so now Dave and Nick were left, but they were the talent in the band. And it just so happened that they invited Bob back, and when Frank heard them sing as a three, he signed them to that management contract, and this is where they rehearsed for 6 to 8 hours a day for several months, and then fortunately they got a bit of a break. It was 1957 when Phyllis Diller had to cancel a week's worth of gigs at the Purple Onion in San Francisco, and Frank, being the savvy manager that he was, he got in touch with the venue and said, "I've got 3 guys that can fill in these dates for you at short notice." So he convinced the venue to go ahead with this arrangement, and Dave sent out 500 postcards to everyone that he knew and the other band members knew. They also plastered the city with handbills and really promoted it as much as possible. And the crowds came, and because they'd been rehearsing so much, they were the finished article. So they put on a great show, they were tight, and everyone was really impressed, to the point where the venue extended that week's worth of shows to 6 months worth of shows. So the Kingston Trio really did grab their opportunity with both hands and were prepared for that break that they did get. So Frank booked a national tour off the back of all of this success, and he networked in order to get in touch with Capitol Records, and they then signed an exclusive 7-year deal with Capitol Records. In 1958, they released their debut album, the Kingston Trio, and it was selling moderately well, but this song, Tom Dooley, was getting a lot of radio airplay in Salt Lake City. So there was such demand for this to be released as a standalone single that Capitol Records did, and that's where it went straight to number 1, sold over 1 million copies immediately, but then sold over 3 million in all. They won that Grammy in 1959 that I mentioned earlier, and from 1958 to 1959 they released 5 albums, and they all went in to the number 1 spot. So they had a massive impact on the charts and were one of the biggest selling artists for Capitol Records at that time, making Capitol Records $25 million, which is the equivalent of $210 million in today's money. They sold over 8 million albums. Unfortunately, in 1961, there were disputes happening within the band, and it was very much Dave against Bob and Nick. I think Dave maybe wanted to take a bit more control of the band, whereas the other two just wanted to keep it as it was. Also, there were some things being said about trying to copyright public domain songs, such as those old folk songs that nobody really knows who wrote, but then trying to put a copyright on them to earn money from them. Maybe it's coming from that business angle. It always tends to go sour when money becomes involved. Anyway, it just so happened that Dave resigned from the band and he was paid $300,000 from the other two to have a clean break. I think it's fair to say that nobody had told the band members how much the record label had made, over $25 million, but then in order to get a clean break, Dave got $300,000, which, if you analyse the whole band getting under $1 million and the record label earning over $25 million, there's certainly a low percentage split going on. But that's the record industry. So Jon Stewart joined the band at this time. They were still successful between 1961 and 1963. They had a huge hit with Where Have All the Flowers Gone? But folk as a genre was moving on, and as I mentioned earlier, getting a little bit more political with its lyrical content and connecting with people at that level. They were also seen as maybe a bit more commercial by other people who were into folk and other folk artists. And of course, in the 60s, we had that thing called the British Invasion, which meant that a lot of bands at that time fell by the wayside. So towards the end of the 60s, there was a hiatus. They all went their separate ways, and Jon Stewart had a lot of success himself, including writing the song Daydream Believer for the Monkees and Runaway Train for Rosanne Cash. But talking about these guys and their performance here, they didn't have it easy back in the late 50s, early 60s, because a lot of the folk community, I think, wanted to pigeonhole them, or at least be able to describe their sound, whereas it seems like it crossed a lot of genres. You could throw in country, and then you've got the bluegrass banjo sound in there as well, but not really up-tempo with this particular track, but having the folk content and the serious lyrical content that's in there. I think they do cross over genres, and for people trying to pigeonhole them, it was maybe a little bit difficult, and they found it maybe a little bit annoying that they had a commercial side as well. I don't know. There are a lot of real purists who like a particular sound of folk music, for example, and as soon as something gets a little bit too commercial, they don't like that side of it. But ultimately, they were just making the music that they wanted to make and just sounded how they did, and sometimes it's better not to pigeonhole any artist or any band and just listen to the music and enjoy it. It's great to have a look back at this performance back in 1958 with a really interesting backstory to this composition and where it came from in the first place. Thank you guys so much for suggesting this video for me to take a look at, and keep those suggestions coming in the comments below. Let me know what you guys think, and if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe, and I'll see you guys at the next one. Rock!